Welcome to my YouTube channel and to my train room. For this week's video I'm going to respond to the request of one of my viewers, and I'm going to walk through the steps in making a detailed part that I've shown on some of my structures. If we look at Denos storage solutions, we see the air ducts on the roof and some more down this corner here. That one's just put there to hide a rather awkward corner in the building that I don't like the way it turns out. And these are here to hide where the building hits the backdrop. If we pan around to the corner of the room, I need a lot more roof details and a lot more air ducts on National Widget. So I'm going to head over to the workbench and make some more. So let me get the camera turned around and I'll be right back. Air ducts like this are not difficult to build, however they are quite time consuming. The most time consuming part is the corner sections like this. Normally I would start with a piece of plastic tubing from Plastruct or Evergreen such as this. And that's a great base for the inside curve of a sharp corner. But what happens if I want a more sweeping bend? I could use a piece of PVC pipe, but there's a couple of problems there. The most awkward being that styrene cement won't stick to it. I would have to use super glue, and the joints are always going to be questionable at best. It's also a lot more awkward to cut. So what I'm going to do is start with this piece of 1/2-inch copper pipe, and I'm going to wrap a strip of 10,000 styrene around it. In order to go all the way around the tube, you need just over 3 times its diameter, and since it's only 10,000 thick, I want to go around at least twice, so I need a little bit more than 6 times the outside diameter of the tube. Welcome back. I've allowed my styrene rings to go nice and hard and then push them off the end of the copper tube. I've finished with that now. I've cleaned them up a little bit on a piece of fine sandpaper. What I have to do now is check that they are still the right width. So I'm going to put the two side by side and measure them. See, if they ended up not quite the width I wanted them, then I would just use thicker or thinner styrene for the side plates. The two together are exactly 13 millimeters, which is what I planned for. So the 30,000 styrene for the sides is still perfect. I've got a supply of scraps here, mainly because I'm too cheap to waste them. So I'm just going to draw 16 and 32 millimeter circles on each of the X's, trying to get them as centered as possible. Let's just give it a test fit. That looks like it's going to work, and the circles look as though they're fairly concentric, so I'm reasonably happy with that laying out. What I'm going to do now is cut away most of the inside circle before I attach these. That will make it a lot easier later. So cutting the center holes out, you may think of a drill first, but large holes in thin styrene generally don't cut well, so I've just used a craft knife. It's a lot easier. I've gone a little way inside the circle. I will true it up later with files once the whole thing is assembled and is nice and hard. But for now I'm just going to glue those on. Now I need to cut some ribs exactly the same height as those, which is 6.5 millimeters. You'll notice I'm not measuring where these go. I just put a few of these ribs on each ring so that the two sides end up parallel with each other. Well, while this was setting up, I cut these out, first cutting them oversize and then finishing off with a large flat file until I have the right size disc. I've cleaned these up with sandpaper so that everything is in the same plane, and now I've just got to glue these on. Right, there's two. And once again I am back to waiting. At some point in the construction we have to clean up the inside. I've chosen to do it now. First with a knife, and then this full-size round file, and then with a fine half round. It doesn't have to be perfect because air ducts, or at least exposed air ducts, often get dinged up and it will just look like dents. Now what I've got to do before I put the wrap around it is make sure these stiffeners don't stick out too far. So I'm just going to cut them off. They can be undersized but not oversized. And now I just need a wrapper around the outside. I'm going to use the 10,000 styrene again. Since the outside diameter is approximately twice the inside, I need much longer pieces than this, so I'm going to start a new sheet. And I need to make sure that it's sufficient to go a little bit beyond the edge. So if I go about 7.5 millimeters, I should be okay. Before I left the room yesterday, I added some Tamiya putty to one side of each of these because I don't think I got the top plate on parallel. It's a lot easier to add it on now before I file the rim off, and if it doesn't need it, then it just gets filed off or sanded off. Next step is to get rid of that on a piece of sandpaper. When it comes time to get rid of the rest of the base, what I'm doing is cutting it off with a knife, leaving a little bit of a lip, which I will then sand off. If you try to cut too close to the knife, you're likely to end up cutting too much off. So anyway, there is the finished ring. All that remains to do now is to cut it into quarters with the razor saw, and then we'll have 4 corners for the air ducts. The straight pieces of air duct are simplicity themselves. If you can find a piece of square tubing the right size, just use that. For the larger sizes you can make your own with styrene, or if you find a piece of square tubing a little bit smaller, we can enlarge it. This is 6mm tube and I need an 8mm overall width. So what I've done is got some 40,000 styrene. Once again, it's just an offcut. At the moment I'm cutting the strips a little bit over wide. It's a lot easier to file them off later once the glue joints are hard than it is to get everything perfect the first time round. And now I just got to leave that to set up, but when it's nice and hard I will come back and file these ridges off. Real air ducts are generally put together in sections a few feet long. I found that cutting my tube into scale 8-foot sections looks about right. Of course, you don't really have to cut them. You can just put thin strips of styrene around to make the flange, but doing it that way, you've got to get them absolutely square, otherwise it's going to look silly. I found I get better results by cutting the tube into the sections and then building the flanges out of squares of styrene. So just take a scrap of thin styrene. This is 20 thou. Because these air ducts are 8mm square, I've marked a grid of 10mm squares for the flanges. Of course, it means that that joint is going to be sticking up a scale 3.5 inches, which is quite excessive. It's one of those things that if we made it to scale, that you really wouldn't be able to see it. So we're probably better off just exaggerating it. And then what I do is I just scribe everything and leave it attached in the sheet until I need it. There we are. And then these, I'll just snap them off as and when I need them. So now we have all the components. Let's assemble an air duct. I start by putting one of the squares on my work surface, putting some solvent on it, adding a section like that. I'll do on the other end. Just build it up. With these overscale flanges, it's a lot easier to get it so it looks right. The smaller the flange, the more critical the adjustment is. But with a whole millimeter sticking out, I have a reasonably good chance of getting it so that it looks perfect, even though it might not be. As you can see, it goes together quite quickly. I'm going to put a short piece in now. I'm going to argue that this run needed to be slightly more than 2 pieces long, so they added a short piece here. And let's use one of the tight bends to go the other way. And go 90 degrees from the other one. I just made this up as I went along because I'm not quite sure where it's going, but I'll find a use for it somewhere. Normally I would get the structure out and figure out where I wanted it to go, but here we are. There's my air duct. All that remains to do now is to paint it and weather it.